Hello, this is Dr. James Hayes-Bohanan at Bridgewater State University. This is part 3 of my narration of the slides I entitled Rondonia, a Real Place. That's because the name might sound made up, but Rondonia is a real place. And in the first 2 segments here, I explained how I became involved in Rondonia and gave some orientation to the place and a little bit of a description of how it started to transition from being a place of a mix of indigenous populations and caboclo populations who were involved in rubber tapping, and how trying to exploit the rubber more fully led to a huge rush of people into this region in the second half of the 20th century. And I did my dissertation research right in the midst of all of that change. And in fact, I chose Rondonia as the site of my research because I was concerned about deforestation in the Amazon, and I decided that if I were studying this, I wanted to study the place that was most affected. So I chose Rondonia. And in fact, around the same time I was getting involved in this, the National Geographic had its centennial issue, and on the cover of the magazine, there was an image from Rondonia, and one of the places I would visit was part of it. So I'm going to go back over to the slides where I left off. And we were looking at this slide, which is a composite satellite image of Rondonia. It comes from the Landsat system, which is a US-based system. And the composites, this mosaic put together of about a dozen or so Landsat images put side by side to make a continuous image of the whole state of Rondonia, was done by people at the Cartographic Laboratory of CEDAM, which is a state agency studying environmental issues in the state of Rondonia. And we can see this herringbone pattern, we call it, going along the highway. We see this is the BR-364, and I'm going to show you a couple of other detailed set from satellite images from the same system to show you what's going on here. I should point out that this is satellite imagery. All satellite imagery is a series of numbers that come down, and so they look like color photographs, but they usually are not. This is partly because some of the imagery, some of the information isn't even visible to the human eye. This includes this image comes from data that are partly visible and partly infrared, beyond the human eyesight range, and so they get coded and presented in colors, but they aren't really color images. And so that's why a cleared area that would probably be like a light tan, like sandy beach in real life, is shown in pink here. And then some dark pink here are some wetland areas that are saturated soil. But the light pink are clearings. We see puffs of clouds here and there because this is where the intertropical convergence zone is present, either here or near here throughout the year. Most of these were probably taken in the Amazon winter, which does not mean it gets cold, but every part of the Amazon has a part that's relatively drier, a part of the year that's relatively drier. So these images would have been taken from the dry portion of the year, which corresponds to their winter, which corresponds to our summer, because this is 9 degrees south latitude. Anyway, I mention that because the people who put this together had to go through a series of images. Any given place would have an image taken about every 12 days, and they would go through and pick out which ones have the least cloud cover so that we can make some land use comparisons. And they're documenting the extreme deforestation that I knew was going on here, but I hadn't seen it represented like this before. Up here is the city of Porto Velho, and there's kind of a random pattern of clearing around that. But as we come down, still in the north central part of the state, there's the Rio Candeias, the river Candles, it's called, and the reservoir that goes with that. It's showing some saturated area near there, which looks just like natural wetland, but that's all artificial wetland. And then we come down this famous BR-364 highway I mentioned, and we see what's called a herringbone pattern, because what the government did in encouraging settlement in this area, every 10 kilometers or 6 miles along the highway, They just made a parallel road off into the rainforest. And these are just called lines or líneas. And every 10 kilometers, a very simple, very straight road would be cut. Now it's straight on the map, which means in real life it goes up and downhill a lot, because they didn't contour the lines at all. They just drew them as straight as they could, following their perpendicular lines from the main highway. And then land was given to anybody who would settle the area. And this is explained more in my What a Difference a Century Makes essay. But the land was given away in units of 100 hectares, which is about just under 250 acres. And the commitment that people made was that they would farm half of that land and leave half of it in rainforest. And the spacing was such that this should have left a lot of the land as forest in between these lines. That's not ideal. It's breaking up habitat, but it would have at least left more than half of the land as forest. In reality, people found that they could, even though they'd have a very productive crop in their first year or two, after that the soil would be depleted, because the soil was only enriched from the burning of trees. The soil would be depleted and they would move on, and they would eventually clear their entire plot and maybe even move farther into the forest, since there was really no way to regulate what they did with the land. And quite often investors would come along and buy up land from several different owners. People who got that original grant would sell out after they gave up on the farming. And so I met people who had maybe, instead of 250 acres, maybe 2,000 acres, if they had bought from small farmers after those farmers had given up. And so we see a lot more clearing than was anticipated in the original legislation that brought people to this area. And that's kind of why the name Babalu appears at the top of the screen. Babalu was a geography student at the Federal University of Rondonia, who also worked part-time at SEDAM. And she gave me this, I still have this paper printout of some Landsat imagery from 1994, from a couple years before my visit, that she gave to me on a bus. And she insisted that I not associate it with her real name. This was a nickname that she had. And I think we're long ago and far enough away that I can say that. But she was really nervous about disclosing this, even though all the information was publicly available to anybody who had the technology to access Landsat imagery. Anybody could find this information, but the fact that it was all put together like this was pretty controversial. And in fact, while I was there, the government insisted on a change, partly as a result of this image. They said that no longer would individual farmers be allowed to clear up to 50% of their land. They would only be allowed to clear up to 20% of their land. But this was already understood to be sort of a fiction, because in some parts of the state, one could go down BR 364 and hardly see a tree at all. So changing the requirement from 50% to 20% as a maximum clearing was a fiction that would maybe apply at some distance away from the road, but really was too late. By the way, you'll notice this is the highway we're talking about, the BR 364, and this continues on. If we keep going southeast from here, this would eventually take you into the more urban areas of the country. There's also a road that goes over here straight out to the west, and this is headed toward the Bolivian border. And this was a road I did not travel on, and this was starting to be developed as well, and was also the conduit for a lot of illicit trafficking of drugs into the state. And so in fact, right here in the middle of all this deforestation is one city I did visit, in which there were timber mills and jewelry stores, because there was a lot of gold moving and a lot of drugs moving. what the satellite images show uh, in more detail, this is just showing one of those images that eventually were composited there. And this is from somewhere in Rondonia. I'm not sure exactly where. This comes from the U.S. Geological Survey, and their website actually, if you search U.S. Geological Survey for Rondonia, you'll find some of these images. Again, these are digital images, and so the way they're represented can be any colors, and it's quite common to represent green as red because it comes from the infrared. That's how we know where the vegetation is. So this thick red cover really represents forest cover over like 99% of this image. And this is in 1975, just in one particular part of Rondonia. If we come back in 1982, 7 years later, the same image, the same place, you see the líneas have been cut in, and the clearing takes place along the líneas, and even in the middle between, way in between two lines, there's clearing. The light blue represents almost bare soil. And you can see here also a town has grown up. The government did pay for towns to be placed pretty much every place there was one of those telegraph stations. There would be a town constructed. They were called rural settlements of urban support or something like that, noirs they were called, and they provided like a school and a health clinic and a few basic services. And those sometimes eventually grew up into pretty big towns as people gave up on the farming. By 1992, you can see that where there was the clearing, the bare soil, we now have vegetation again. It's shown in the light red or pink. That's a reforestation, but it turns out it's really questionable what the quality of that forest is in terms of wildlife habitat compared to the original forest. And this is what people have been quite concerned about. I'll stop this segment with this image. I mentioned before, Lee Klockman. He took the photo to the left in the mid-90s, and then I captured from NASA in August 2010 this overview image, again in the area of northern, just around the area of Portugallo, and all the little red dots and smoke are showing the rainforest pattern, and some of it even occurring now outside of the state of Rondonia. But the image that Lee took from a distance of the rainforest shows you just how enormous these burnings would be, what's called slash and burn. Now, indigenous people have been doing slash and burn agriculture in the Amazon basin for thousands of years, but they tended to do it on a pretty small scale, measured in a few acres at a time. When we have the burning moving up into hundreds of acres, we end up with much more significant fire, and kind of the difference in scale makes for a difference in the nature of the clearing. It simplifies the landscape, replacing a complex forest with much more simple forests that come after. And the scale of the fire here can really be understood if you realize that there are probably 100-foot tall trees here. Those shadows are trees that are 100 feet tall or so, and the flames just dwarf that. So when fire happens on that scale, it's really simplifying the landscape over a long period of time, and that's what a lot of the concern has been about. So I'm going to end the segment here, and we will resume with a little bit more of the Rondonia story in segment 4.